The Magic Mirror Killer, the true story of Andreas Bichel's Bavarian crimes. The mirror reflected nothing but darkness. Andreas Bichel's hands moved across the glass with practiced precision, polishing until his reflection disappeared into shadow. The workshop smelled of beeswax and something else, something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. Outside, the Bavarian sun painted Regensdorf in warm afternoon light. Inside, the air felt cold enough to stop breath. His fingers traced the ornate frame, carved with symbols most villagers couldn't read. Beautiful work, meticulous, the kind of craftsmanship that took time, patience, devotion. Then a sound. Not quite a scream, more like the memory of one trapped somewhere below the floorboards. Bichel didn't flinch. He kept polishing, kept working. The stain beneath his workbench had been there for weeks now, dark and spreading slowly across the wood grain like roots searching for water. He'd stopped trying to scrub it away. They called him a fortune teller, a healer, a man who could see your future in glass, who could cure ailments the doctors gave up on, who could answer questions the church refused to touch. Mothers brought their daughters to him. Husbands brought their wives. The desperate brought their hope, and Andreas Bichel, respected, educated, trusted Andreas Bichel gave them answers. What they didn't know was that he'd already decided their futures. What they couldn't see was that some of those daughters never made it home. The hammer lay beside the mirror, its handle wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. One strike, that's all it ever took. One precise moment when trust turned to terror, when a young woman leaning close to see her destiny in the glass realized too late that she was looking at her end. No one in Regensdorf suspected. How could they? Andreas was one of them. He attended church. He paid his taxes. He smiled at children in the street and helped elderly neighbors carry their grain to market. He was exactly what a small Bavarian village needed in 1807, a bridge between the old superstitions and the new enlightenment, someone who could heal with herbs and predict with mirrors, who made magic feel safe. But magic, real magic, always demands payment. And Andreas Bichel had been collecting his due for nearly 2 years. Between 1806 and 1808, at least 7 young women vanished from the Bavarian countryside. They went missing in daylight, the kind of daylight that doesn't hide lies. No storms, no bandits on the roads, just ordinary days that started with bread baking and ended with families searching empty bedrooms, calling names into forests that never answered back. The girls had things in common: young, unmarried, working class, servants mostly, a few farmhands. The kind of women society noticed when they were useful and forgot when they weren't. Catherine, Barbara, Maria, Anna, Teresa, Magdalena, Elizabeth, names that appeared in parish records and employment ledgers, then simply stopped. They said the girls ran away, eloped with traveling merchants, got tired of serving wealthy families and started new lives in Munich or Vienna. That's what people wanted to believe, because the alternative, that something dark was hunting in their safe Christian villages, was unthinkable. They were wrong. Every single one of those women had visited Andreas Bichel's workshop within 48 hours of disappearing. Everyone had sat across from him, nervous and hopeful, asking about love or health or fortune. Everyone had leaned forward to peer into one of his famous mirrors, trying to glimpse the future he promised was waiting there. And everyone had seen their reflection for the last time. But here's what didn't make sense. Andreas Bichel was beloved, respected, the last person anyone would suspect. And in a region where gossip traveled faster than horses, how did 7 women disappear from his doorstep without a single witness, a single connection, a single raised eyebrow? The answer to that question is darker than you think. If you think this is just another tale of a small-town predator, you're already wrong. What Andreas Bichel did wasn't just murder, it was theater, it was art. It was a kind of devotion so twisted that when authorities finally understood it, some of them refused to believe human beings were capable of such calculated evil. Subscribe now, because what comes next will make you question how evil hides in plain sight, how it smiles at you in the marketplace, how it offers to help your daughter see her future husband's face. And trust me, you don't want to miss what investigators found behind that mirror. Bavaria in 1806 wasn't the Germany you might picture. This was before unification, before industry, before the old ways died completely. Villages like Regensdorf existed in a strange twilight, still deeply superstitious, still tied to folk magic, but also reaching toward enlightenment, toward a modern world that felt both exciting and terrifying. Into this world, Andreas Bichel fit perfectly. He was in his mid-40s, educated enough to read Latin but practical enough to work with his hands. He trained as a tailor in his youth, then learned herbalism from monks, then somehow, no one quite remembered how, acquired a reputation for fortune-telling. Not the carnival kind, not theatrical crystal balls. No, Andreas practiced what he called mirror divination, an ancient art he claimed to have learned from manuscripts in Munich. His workshop sat at the edge of Regensdorf, a modest building that smelled perpetually of beeswax, dried herbs, and lingering smoke from whatever he burned in his brazier. The front room served as his consultation space, comfortable chairs, shelves lined with bottles of tinctures and salves, and of course, the mirrors. 7 of them, though the number changed sometimes, each different, each supposedly attuned to different types of visions. The mirror of lost love could show you your true match. The mirror of health revealed the source of illness. The mirror of fortune told you when to plant crops, when to travel, when to take risks. People came from 3 villages over to consult Andreas Bichel. They paid him in coin when they had it, in bread and preserves when they didn't. He never turned anyone away. He listened with genuine attention, asked thoughtful questions, offered remedies that often worked. What they didn't know was that his gift wasn't prophecy. It was patience. Andreas Bichel understood that trust is built slowly, one interaction at a time. He'd spent years becoming indispensable to Regensdorf, years learning who was sick, who was desperate, who was vulnerable, years watching young women come of age, noting which ones were isolated, which families wouldn't ask too many questions if a daughter went missing. He was a hunter, and he'd been preparing his ground for a very long time. Young women came to him for love readings mostly. That's what girls in 1806 Bavaria cared about, finding husbands, escaping service, glimpsing a future less hard than the present. Andreas welcomed them warmly. He'd offer tea, ask about their families, put them at ease. Then he'd bring out the mirror of lost love, a beautiful piece with an ornate silver frame, and ask them to gaze into it while he spoke the ancient words. "Look deeply," he'd say, his voice gentle. "Look until your eyes adjust to the darkness. Your true love's face will appear where yours should be." And the girls would lean forward, would stare into that polished glass, would wait for magic to happen. That's when Andreas would reach for the hammer. One decision changed everything. Catherine Seidel was 19 years old in June 1806, employed as a servant in a magistrate's household in Regensdorf. She was saving money for a dowry, hoping to marry a carpenter's apprentice named Johann who'd smiled at her after church. But Johann was poor, and Catherine needed some sign that waiting for him was the right choice. So she went to Andreas Bichel. Her employer later remembered Catherine asking for the afternoon off. "Just a few hours," she'd said. "I need to see the fortune teller about something personal." The magistrate's wife gave permission without hesitation. Everyone trusted Andreas. Catherine walked to his workshop in bright afternoon sunlight, carrying a small purse with 3 coins, probably everything she'd saved that month. Neighbors saw her knock on his door, saw Andreas welcome her inside with his kind smile, saw the door close. No one ever saw Catherine Seidel again. By evening, the magistrate's wife was annoyed. By midnight, she was worried. By dawn, she was at the constable's office, reporting her servant missing. The constable asked the obvious questions. Did Catherine have enemies, a lover, debts? No. The constable made notes, promised to ask around, but in his experience, young servant girls who disappeared had usually run off with traveling men or gotten pregnant and fled to the city. Tragic, perhaps, but not criminal. Catherine's parents were informed. They grieved, they prayed, But they couldn't afford to push authorities, couldn't demand investigations. Their daughter was gone, and the world kept turning. What the constable didn't do, what no one thought to do, was ask Andreas Bichel if he'd seen Catherine that day. Because why would they? But Catherine didn't run away. She never left that room. Over the next 2 years, the pattern repeated with horrifying precision. Barbara Lechner disappeared in September 1806. 18, a farmhand known for her skill with animals. She visited Andreas to ask if her soldier would return from the wars. She never made it home. Maria Reisinger vanished in January 1807, 21 years old, working as a kitchen servant, desperate to know if the merchant's son courting her was serious. She went to the workshop. She didn't come back. Anna Gruber, March 1807, 19 years old. Teresa Wimmer, July 1807, 22 years old. Magdalena Huber, October 1807, 19 years old. Elizabeth Bauer, February 1808, 20 years old. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. Young woman visits Andreas Bichel, young woman vanishes, family reports her missing, authorities assume she ran away. Different villages, months between incidents, and because these were working-class girls, servants, laborers, people who existed in the margins, no one connected the dots. No one except the families. They whispered among themselves, shared their grief in quiet conversations after church. Some even traveled to consult Andreas themselves, asking his mirrors to show them where their daughters had gone. He was sympathetic, helpful. He performed readings, accepted payment, told them their daughters were alive and well in distant cities. He lied with the ease of someone who'd practiced in mirrors. But grief has its own kind of sight, and in March 1808, one woman's grief became rage. Barbara Reisinger, sister of Maria, who disappeared 13 months earlier, refused to believe her sister had run away. Maria was practical, responsible, devoted to their ailing mother. She wouldn't have left without word. Something had happened to her. Barbara started asking questions, not gentle questions. She demanded answers from the constable, from the magistrate, from anyone who'd listen. And when no one took her seriously, she did something remarkable for a woman in 1806 Bavaria. She investigated herself. She traveled to the villages where other young women had disappeared, found their families, asked about circumstances, and slowly, impossibly, a pattern emerged. Every girl had visited the fortune teller. Barbara brought her findings to the local magistrate in Regensdorf, a man named Herr Friedrich Waldmann. She laid out the evidence: 7 names, 7 disappearances, 7 visits to Andreas Bichel's workshop. Waldmann's first response was dismissal. Correlation isn't causation, Fräulein Reisinger. Many people visit Herr Bichel. But Barbara wouldn't leave. She stood in his office and said something that haunted Waldmann for the rest of his life. If it were your daughter, Herr Magistrate, would correlation be enough? He thought about his own daughters, about their visits to Andreas for remedies. And for the first time, someone in authority felt the cold finger of doubt. Waldmann agreed to investigate. He obtained a warrant to search Bichel's workshop, citing concerns about illegal medical practices. It was flimsy, but it was something. The raid happened on April 12, 1808. 6 constables accompanied Magistrate Waldmann to the modest building at the village edge. They knocked. Andreas opened the door with his usual warm smile, surprised but cooperative. "Of course, Herr Magistrate, search wherever you like. I have nothing to hide." And for 2 hours, it seemed he was telling the truth. They found exactly what you'd expect: mirrors, herbs, candles, books of folk remedies. His living quarters, tidy, modest, unremarkable. His tools from his tailoring days, needles, thread, leatherworking equipment, nothing suspicious. Waldmann was preparing to apologize when one of the constables, Klaus Bauer, whose sister Elizabeth had disappeared 2 months earlier, noticed something odd. The floorboards near the largest mirror weren't the same color as the others. "Herr Bichel," Klaus said, When did you replace these boards? Andreas glanced at them. Some months ago, water damage from a leak. But Klaus was already kneeling, running his fingers along the seams. The boards were new, yes, but they'd been installed hastily without proper nails. They weren't secured, they were just placed. Magistrate, Klaus said, I want these boards removed. Andreas's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes. If you insist, Andreas said, though I assure you there's nothing beneath but earth. They removed the boards and discovered that Andreas Bichel had been lying about everything. Most people scroll past stories like this. They think that was centuries ago, that could never happen now. But the truth is, predators still hide behind trust, behind community respect, behind closed doors. That's exactly how Andreas Bichel murdered 7 women, while an entire region turned away. Don't be one of them. Subscribe so you don't stay silent, because the patterns haven't changed, only the mirrors have. The smell hit them first. Not decay, Andreas had been too careful for that. Something else. Chemicals, preservation, the sharp tang of salt and lime and substances Klaus couldn't identify but would smell in nightmares for decades. Waldman ordered lanterns brought. They lowered light into the darkness beneath Bichel's workshop. The space was maybe 8 feet deep, 10 feet wide, not quite a cellar, more like a chamber, deliberately constructed. And along the walls, arranged with terrible precision, were 7 bodies. But not whole bodies. Andreas Bichel had skinned his victims. The constables who descended into that chamber, men who'd served in the Napoleonic Wars, who'd seen battlefield carnage, emerged vomiting, weeping, changed. The bodies had been meticulously preserved using techniques that seemed almost medical. Each woman had been flayed with surgical care, the skin removed in large sections and treated with some process that kept it supple, workable. The remaining remains were wrapped in cloth, labeled with names and dates in Andreas's neat handwriting. Catherine Seidel, June 18, 1806. Barbara Lechner, September 22, 1806. Maria Reisinger, January 7, 1807. 7 names, 7 women who'd walked into Andreas Bichel's workshop seeking futures and found only darkness. But the true horror was what the investigation revealed next. When they examined the mirrors, those beautiful, ornate mirrors that Andreas used for divination, they discovered that the backing wasn't parchment or wood or metal. It was skin, human skin, treated and stretched and carefully applied to the back of the polished glass. Each mirror contained a piece of a victim. The mirror of lost love, backed with Catherine Seidel's skin. The mirror of health, backed with Barbara Lechner's. When they opened the wall behind Andreas's workbench, it wasn't empty. It was waiting. More skin, stretched and drying, more materials for more mirrors. For a full 10 seconds, no one in that workshop spoke. Andreas Bichel stood in the center of the room, hands clasped behind his back, expression calm, almost serene. He didn't deny, didn't run. He just waited, like a craftsman interrupted mid-project. Arrest him, Waldman finally managed. Of course, Andreas said politely, but you should know, you've interrupted something important. I was very close to completion. The interrogation of Andreas Bichel lasted 3 days. He confessed to everything, not reluctantly, not under torture. He simply explained, like a professor lecturing students. He'd killed all 7 women, lured them with promises of fortune-telling, struck them from behind with a hammer, then carefully, methodically, skinned their bodies using techniques he'd learned from anatomy texts and butchering manuals. But here's what made investigators' blood run cold. Andreas Bichel wasn't driven by sexual desire. He wasn't angry at women. His motive was something far stranger. He genuinely believed the skin of pure, young women held magical properties. According to his confession, Andreas had spent years researching ancient texts on divination and occult practices. He'd become convinced that true prophecy, Not the parlor tricks he performed for paying customers, but real sight beyond the veil required specific materials. And the most potent material was the skin of virgins, properly harvested and consecrated. They died to give me vision, he told Magistrate Waldman, to make the mirrors work. I was building something real, something that could actually see. He didn't kill them for pleasure, he killed them for prophecy. The judges struggled to comprehend this. They understood murder for money, murder for passion, but murder for magic. Andreas showed no remorse during his trial. He explained his methodology with pride. He described how he'd chosen victims, always young, always alone, always desperate enough to visit his workshop without company. And then he revealed something worse. They found his journal in the hidden chamber, leather-bound, hundreds of pages of notes, diagrams, calculations. The mirror of eternal truth. According to his notes, true prophecy required 12 mirrors, 12 pieces of 12 different souls. He'd completed 7, was close to securing number 8, a young seamstress who'd already scheduled an appointment for later that month. 3 more after that, and his masterwork would be complete. They were already marked, the prosecutor read from the journal, already chosen, already dead in his mind. The 3 women Andreas had selected for victims 8 through 10 were in the courtroom when this was revealed. They fainted, had to be carried out. Andreas Bichel was convicted on 7 counts of murder in June 1808. The sentence was death by breaking wheel. He accepted it without complaint. 7 families finally had answers, finally could bury their daughters properly, with dignity, with names carved in stone. Barbara Reisinger attended every burial. She wept at each one, even for the women she'd never met. And at her sister Maria's funeral, standing in the rain as they lowered the casket, she spoke words that became legend. "I'm sorry I didn't see sooner. I'm sorry I needed proof before I believed you were worth saving." The community's shame was profound and lasting. They'd trusted Andreas Bichel, defended him, sent their daughters to him, and all the while, beneath the floorboards of his workshop, the evidence of their blindness had been waiting. The victims weren't just murdered, they were erased, reduced to materials. Their futures, the loves they might have found, the children they might have raised, cut short for a madman's delusion. Catherine Zeidel, 19, who wanted to marry a carpenter. Maria Reisinger, 21, who loved the merchant's son. Barbara Lechner, 18, who was kind to animals. Anna Gruber, 19, who sang in the church choir. Teresa Wimmer, 22, who baked the best bread in her village. Magdalena Huber, 19, who dreamed of seeing Vienna. Elizabeth Bauer, 20, who wrote poetry no one ever read. They had names, they had lives, and they were stolen by a man the world trusted. Because what happened in that workshop isn't just his story, it's ours. It's about the women we don't protect because they're servants, because they're poor, because they're young and expendable. It's about how evil wears respectability like a mask. Barbara Reisinger spent the rest of her life advocating for the families of missing persons. She pushed for changes in how authorities investigated disappearances, especially of working-class women. She demanded that every report be taken seriously, that patterns be examined. Some of her reforms actually took hold, not many, not enough, but some. And in Regensdorf, the 7 victims are remembered in a small memorial near the church. 7 stones, 7 names, and 1 inscription. They sought their futures. They deserved to find them. If these 7 women's stories shook you, don't just move on. Subscribe so their voices don't fade into another forgotten chapter of history, because Andreas Bichel almost got away with it, almost completed his masterwork, almost killed 12 women before anyone with power cared enough to investigate. And if you won't subscribe, at least tell us why in the comments. Maybe silence has its reasons, or maybe we just need to be louder than the people who choose not to see. Andreas Bichel was executed on June 9, 1808. They broke him on the wheel in Regensdorf's main square. Hundreds attended. The breaking wheel was medieval brutality designed to maximize suffering, to make death slow and public. But Andreas Bichel didn't scream. As they shattered his limbs, as they lifted him onto the wheel to die, he spoke. His voice was calm, almost peaceful. "The mirrors still work," he said. "They always will." The crowd thought he was mad, but some of the constables who'd been in that workshop, who'd seen the terrible precision of his work, wondered, felt cold despite the summer heat. His workshop was burned to the ground the day after his execution. They burned everything, the chambers, the tools, the journals. The mirrors were destroyed, smashed and buried in unconsecrated ground. Except one. One mirror was kept as evidence, sealed in the Munich Criminal Archive. The mirror of lost love, backed with Catherine Zeidel's skin, preserved as proof that such evil had existed, had been punished, had been stopped. And somewhere in Bavaria, in a locked vault in a building most people don't know exists, that mirror still waits. Archivists report that no one's looked at it in decades. The catalogue lists it simply, evidence, case 1808A, murder sealed. But it's there. The glass that Catherine Zeidel leaned toward on that June afternoon in 1806, hoping to see her future husband's face. The frame Andreas Bichel carved with symbols of prophecy. The backing made from the skin of a 19-year-old girl who just wanted to know if love was waiting. The case became one of Bavaria's most notorious criminal cases. It was cited in legal reforms, in discussions of investigative procedures, in arguments about how society protects its most vulnerable. Barbara Reisinger died in 1853, 45 years after her sister's murder. Her tombstone sits next to Maria's. The inscription she chose, she asked the right questions. The 7 women are still remembered in Regensdorf. On the anniversary of the workshop raid, April 12th, some locals still place flowers at the memorial. Fewer each year, memory fades. But some questions never quite get answered. Where did Andreas Bichel learn his craft? His journal mentioned the old methods, the master's teachings, but no master was ever identified. The techniques he used seemed too sophisticated for self-teaching. Someone taught him, someone knew. Or worse, someone else was out there, practicing the same dark art, creating their own tools from human remains. The Munich archives contain hundreds of unsolved disappearance cases from 18th and 19th century Bavaria. Young women, mostly, servants and farmhands, girls who ran away and were never seen again. How many of those cases involved mirrors? Was Andreas the first, or just the first one caught? Because predators don't spring fully formed from nothing. They learn, they refine, they pass knowledge to others. And somewhere in the historical record, there might be a thread, a connection, a pattern waiting to be seen. But only if someone looks. But if you think the magic mirror killer was the darkest case to emerge from 19th century Bavaria, wait till you hear about the woman who poisoned an entire village and was never caught. 34 deaths over 7 years, all attributed to natural causes at the time. All connected by one common thread that no one noticed until it was far too late. That story is coming next. Stay subscribed, stay curious. And whatever you do, don't look away. The mirrors are broken, the workshop is ash, Andreas Bichel is 2 centuries dead. But his final words echo still. The mirrors still work, they always will. Maybe he was mad. Or maybe he understood something true about evil, that it doesn't die. It just waits for the next person willing to polish the glass, willing to ask victims to lean close, willing to show them futures that will never come. The magic wasn't in the mirrors. It was in the trust. And that particular magic, the spell that makes us believe safety lives in familiarity, that monsters don't wear kind faces, that magic is still working perfectly. Still claiming victims. Still waiting for someone brave enough to look beneath the floorboards.